The Unprincipled Affair of the Practical Joker by Dorothy Sayers. The Zambesi, they said, was expected to dock at 6 in the morning. Mrs. Royslander booked a bedroom in the Magnifical, with despair in her heart. A bare 9 hours, and she would be greeting her husband. After that would begin the sickening period of waiting. It might be days, it might be weeks, possibly even months, for the inevitable discovery. The reception clerk twirled the register towards her. Mechanically, as she signed it, she glanced at the preceding entry. Lord Peter Wimsey and valet, London, Suite 24. Mrs. Royslander's heart seemed to stop for a second. Was it possible that, even now, God had left a loophole? She expected little from him. All her life, he had shown himself a sufficiently stern creditor. It was fantastic to base the frailest hope on this signature of a man she had never even seen. Yet the name remained in her mind while she dined in her own room. She dismissed her maid presently, and sat for a long time looking at her own haggard reflection in the mirror. Twice she rose and went to the door, then turned back, calling herself a fool. The third time she turned the handle quickly and hurried down the corridor, without giving herself time to think. A large golden arrow at the corner directed her to Suite 24. It was 11 o'clock, and nobody was within view. Mrs. Royslander gave a sharp knock on Lord Peter Wimsey's door and stood back, waiting, with the sort of desperate relief one experiences after hearing a dangerous letter thump the bottom of the pillar box. Whatever the adventure, she was committed to it. The manservant was of the imperturbable sort. He neither invited nor rejected, but stood respectfully upon the threshold. "Lord Peter Wimsey?" murmured Mrs. Royslander. "Yes, madam." "Could I speak to him for a moment?" "His lordship has just retired, madam. If you will step in, I will inquire." Mrs. Royslander followed him into one of those palatial sitting rooms which the Magnifical provides for the wealthy pilgrim. "Will you take a seat, madam?" The man stepped noiselessly to the bedroom door and passed in, shutting it behind him. The lock, however, failed to catch, and Mrs. Royslander caught the conversation. "Pardon me, my lord, a lady has called. She mentioned no appointment, so I considered it better to acquaint your lordship." "Excellent discretion," said a voice. It had a slow, sarcastic intonation, which brought a painful flush to Mrs. Royslander's cheek. "I never make appointments. Do I know the lady?" "No, my lord, but, I know her by sight, my lord. It is Mrs. Royslander." "Oh, the diamond merchant's wife. Well, find out tactfully what it's all about, and unless it's urgent, ask her to call tomorrow." The valet's next remark was inaudible, but the reply was, "Don't be coarse, Bunter." The valet returned. "His lordship desires me to ask you, madam, in what way he can be of service to you." "Will you say to him that I have heard of him in connection with the Attenbury diamond case, and am anxious to ask his advice?" "Certainly, madam. May I suggest that as his lordship is greatly fatigued, he would be better able to assist you after he has slept." "If tomorrow would have done, I would not have thought of disturbing him tonight. Tell him I am aware of the trouble I am giving." "Excuse me one moment, madam." This time the door shut properly. After a short interval, Bunter returned to say, "His lordship will be with you immediately, madam," and to place a decanter of wine and a box of Saubernies beside her. Mrs. Royslander lit a cigarette, but had barely sampled its flavor when she was aware of a soft step beside her. Looking round, she perceived a young man attired in a mauve dressing gown of great splendor, from beneath the hem of which peeped coyly a pair of primrose silk pajamas. "You must think it very strange of me, thrusting myself on you at this hour," she said with a nervous laugh. Lord Peter put his head to one side. "Don't know the answer to that," he said. "If I say not at all, it sounds abandoned. If I say yes, very, it's rude. Supposin' we give it a miss, what? And you tell me what I can do for you." Mrs. Royslander hesitated. Lord Peter was not what she had expected. She noted the sleek, straw-colored hair, brushed flat back from a rather sloping forehead, the ugly, lean, arched nose, and the faintly foolish smile, and her heart sank within her. I'm afraid it's ridiculous of me to suppose you can help me," she began. "Always my unfortunate appearance," moaned Lord Peter, with such alarming acumen as to double her discomfort. Would it invite confidence more, do you suppose, if I dyed my hair black and grew a Newgate fringe? It's very trying, you can't think, always to look as if one's name was Algy. I only meant, said Mrs. Royslander, that I don't think anybody could possibly help. But I saw your name in the hotel book, and it seemed just a chance. Lord Peter filled the glasses and sat down. Carry on, he said cheerfully. It sounds interesting. Mrs. Royslander took the plunge. My husband, she explained, is Henry Royslander, the diamond merchant. We came over from Kimberley 10 years ago and settled in England. He spends several months in Africa every year on business, and I'm expecting him back on the Zambesi tomorrow morning. Now this is the trouble. Last year he gave me a magnificent diamond necklace of 115 stones. The Light of Africa, I know, said Wimsey. She looked a little surprised, but assented. The necklace has been stolen from me, and I can't hope to conceal the loss from him. No duplicate would deceive him for an instant. She paused, and Lord Peter prompted gently. You have come to me, I presume, because it is not to be a police matter. Will you tell me quite frankly why? The police would be useless. I know who took it. Yes? There is a man we both know slightly, a man called Paul Melville. Lord Peter's eyes narrowed. Yes, I fancy I've seen him about the clubs. New army, but transferred himself into the regulars. Dark, showy. Bit of an ampelopsis, what? Ampelopsis? Suburban plant that climbs by suction. You know, first year, tender little shoots. Second year, fine show. Next year, all over the shop. Now tell me I am rude. Mrs. Royslander giggled. Now you mention it, he is exactly like an ampelopsis. What a relief to be able to think of him as that. Well, he is some sort of distant relation of my husband's. He called one evening when I was alone. We talked about jewels, and I brought down my jewel box and showed him the Light of Africa. He knows a good deal about stones. I was in and out of the room 2 or 3 times, but didn't think to lock up the box. After he left, I was putting the things away, and I opened the jeweler's case the diamonds were in, and they had gone. Pretty barefaced. Look here, Mrs. Royslander. You agree he's an ampelopsis, but you won't call in the police. Honestly now. Forgive me. You're asking my advice, you know. Is he worth bothering about? It's not that, said the woman in a low tone. Oh, no. But he took something else as well. He took a portrait, a small painting set with diamonds. Oh. Yes. It was in a secret drawer in the jewel box. I can't imagine how he knew it was there, but the box was an old casket belonging to my husband's family, and I fancy he must have known about the drawer and, well, thought that investigation might prove profitable. Anyway, the evening the diamonds went, the portrait went too, and he knows I daren't try to get the necklace back because they'd both be found together. Was there something more than just the portrait, then? A portrait in itself isn't necessarily hopeless of explanation. It was given you to take care of, say. The names were on it, and an inscription which nothing could ever explain away. A passage from Petronius. Oh, dear, said Lord Peter. Dear me, yes, rather a lively author. I was married very young, said Mrs. Royslander, and my husband and I have never got on well. Then one year, when he was in Africa, it all happened. We were wonderful and shameless. It came to an end. I was bitter. I wish I had not been. He left me, you see, and I couldn't forgive it. I prayed day and night for revenge. Only now, I don't want it to be through me. Wait a moment, said Wimsey. You mean that if the diamonds are found and the portrait is found too, all this story is bound to come out? My husband would get a divorce. He would never forgive me, or him. It is not so much that I mind paying the price myself, but, she clenched her hands, I've cursed him again and again, and the clever girl who married him. She played her cards so well. This would ruin them both. But if you were the instrument of vengeance, said Wimsey gently, you would hate yourself. And it would be terrible to you because he would hate you. A woman like you couldn't stoop to get your own back. I see that. If God makes a thunderbolt, how awful and satisfying. If you help to make a beastly row, what a rotten business it would be. You seem to understand, said Mrs. Royslander. How unusual. I understand perfectly. Though let me tell you, said Wimsey with a wry little twist of his lips, that it's sheer foolishness for a woman to have a sense of honor in such matters. It only gives her excruciating pain, and nobody expects it anyway. Look here, don't let's get all worked up about it. You certainly shan't have your vengeance thrust upon you by an Ampelopsis. Why should you? Nasty fellow. We'll have him up, root, branch, and little suckers. Don't worry. Let's see. My business here will take only a day. Then I've got to get to know Melville. Say a week. Then I've got to get the doings. Say another week, provided he hasn't sold them yet, which isn't likely. Can you hold your husband off him for a fortnight, do you think? Oh, yes. I'll say they're in the country, or being cleaned or something. But do you really think you can? I'll have a jolly good try anyhow. Mrs. Royslander, is the fellow hard up to start stealing diamonds? I fancy he has got into debt over horses lately, and possibly poker. Oh, poker player, is he? That makes an excellent excuse for getting to know him. Well, cheer up. We'll get the goods, even if he have to buy 'em. But we won't, if we can help it. Bunter? My lord. The valet appeared from the inner room. Just go and give the all clear, will you? Mr. Bunter accordingly stepped into the passage, and having seen an old gentleman safely away to the bathroom, and a young lady in a pink kimono pop her head out of an adjacent door and hurriedly pop it back on beholding him, blew his nose with a loud trumpeting sound. Good night, said Mrs. Royslander, and thank you. She slipped back to her room unobserved. Whatever has induced you, my dear boy, said Colonel Marchbanks, to take up with that very objectionable fellow, Melville? Diamonds, said Lord Peter. Do you find him so, really? Perfectly dreadful man, said the Honourable Frederick Arbuthnot. Hearts, what did you want to go and get him a room here for? This used to be a quite decent club. 2 clubs, said Sir Impey Biggs, who had been ordering a whisky, and had only caught the last word. No, 1 heart. I beg your pardon. Well, partner, how about spades? Perfectly good suit. Pass, said the colonel. I don't know what the army's coming to nowadays. No trumps, said Wimsey. It's all right, children. Trust your Uncle Pete. Come on, Freddie. How many of those hearts are you going to shout for? None, the colonel having let me down so horrid, said the Honourable Freddie. Cautious blighter. All content? Righty-ho. Bring out your dead, partner. Oh, very pretty indeed. We'll make it a slam this time. I'm rather glad to hear that expression of opinion from you, Colonel, because I particularly want you and Biggie to hang on this evening and take a hand with Melville and me. What happens to me? Inquired the Honourable Freddie. You have an engagement and go home early, dear old thing. I've specially invited friend Melville to meet the redoubtable Colonel Marchbanks and our greatest criminal lawyer. Which hand am I supposed to be playing this from? Oh, yes. Come on, Colonel. You've got to hike out that old king sometime. So why not now? It's a plot, said Mr. Arbuthnot, with an exaggerated expression of mystery. Carry on. Don't mind me. I take it you have your own reasons for cultivating the man, said Sir Impey. The rest are mine, I fancy. Well, yes, I have. You and the colonel would really do me a favor by letting Melville cut in tonight. If you wish it, growled the colonel, but I hope the impudent young beggar won't presume on the acquaintance. I'll see to that, said his lordship. Your cards, Freddie. Who had the ace of hearts? Oh, I had it myself, of course. Our honours. Hello. Evening, Melville. The Ampelopsis was rather a good-looking creature in his own way, tall and bronzed, with a fine row of very persuasive teeth. He greeted Wimsey and Arbuthnot heartily, the colonel with a shade too much familiarity, and expressed himself delighted to be introduced to Sir Impey Biggs. You're just in time to hold Freddie's hand, said Wimsey. He's got a date. Not his little paddy paw, I don't mean, but the damn rotten hand he generally gets dealt him. Joke. Oh, well, said the obedient Freddie, rising. I suppose I'd better make a noise like a hoop and roll away. Night-night, everybody. Melville took his place, and the game continued with varying fortunes for 2 hours, at the end of which time Colonel Marchbanks, who had suffered much under his partner's eloquent theory of the game, was beginning to wilt visibly. Wimsey yawned. Getting a bit bored, Colonel. Wish they'd invent something to liven this game up a bit. Oh, bridge is a one-horse show anyway, said Melville. Why not have a little flutter at poker, Colonel? Do you all the good in the world. What do you say, Biggs? Sir Impey turned on Wimsey a thoughtful eye, accustomed to sizing up witnesses. Then he replied, I'm quite willing, if the others are. Damn good idea. said Lord Peter. "Come now, Colonel, be a sport. You'll find the chips in that drawer, I think. I always lose money at poker, but what's the odds so long as you're happy? Let's have a new pack. Any limit?" "What do you say, Colonel?" The Colonel proposed a 20-shilling limit. Melville, with a grimace, amended this to 1/10 of the pool. The amendment was carried and the cards cut, the deal falling to the Colonel. Contrary to his own prophecy, Wimsey began by winning considerably, and grew so garrulously imbecile in the process that even the experienced Melville began to wonder whether this indescribable fatuity was the cloak of ignorance or the mask of the hardened poker player. Soon, however, he was reassured. The luck came over to his side, and he found himself winning hands down, steadily from Sir Impey and the Colonel, who played cautiously and took little risk, heavily from Wimsey, who appeared reckless and slightly drunk, and was staking foolishly on quite impossible cards. "I never knew such luck as yours, Melville," said Sir Impey, when that young man had scooped in the proceeds from a handsome straight flush. "My turn tonight, yours tomorrow," said Melville, pushing the cards across to Biggs, whose deal it was. Colonel Marchbanks required 1 card. Wimsey laughed vacantly and demanded an entirely fresh hand. Biggs asked for 3, and Melville, after a pause for consideration, took 1. It seemed as though everybody had something respectable this time, though Wimsey was not to be depended upon, frequently going the limit upon a pair of jacks in order, as he expressed it, to keep the pot a-boiling. He became particularly obstinate now, throwing his chips in with a flushed face, in spite of Melville's confident air. The Colonel got out, and after a short time Biggs followed his example. Melville held on till the pool mounted to something under £100, when Wimsey suddenly turned restive and demanded to see him. 4 kings, said Melville. Blast you, said Lord Peter, laying down 4 queens. No holding this feller tonight, is there? Here, take the ruddy cards, Melville, and give somebody else a look in, will you? He shuffled them as he spoke, and handed them over. Melville dealt, satisfied the demands of the other 3 players, and was in the act of taking 3 new cards for himself, when Wimsey gave a sudden exclamation, and shot a swift hand across the table. "Hello, Melville," he said, in a chill tone which bore no resemblance to his ordinary speech. "What exactly does this mean?" He lifted Melville's left arm clear of the table, and, with a sharp gesture, shook it. From the sleeve something fluttered to the table and glided away to the floor. Colonel Marchbanks picked it up, and in a dreadful silence laid the joker on the table. "Good God!" said Sir Impey. "You young blackguard," gasped the Colonel, recovering speech. "What the hell do you mean by this?" gasped Melville, with a face like chalk. "How dare you? This is a trick, a plant." A horrible fury gripped him. "You dare to say that I have been cheating? You liar! You filthy sharper! You put it there! I tell you, gentlemen," he cried, looking desperately round the table, "he must have put it there." "Come, come," said Colonel Marchbanks. "No good carrying on that way, Melville. Dear me, no good at all. Only makes matters worse. We all saw it, you know. Dear, dear, I don't know what the army's coming to." "Do you mean you believe it?" shrieked Melville. "For God's sake, Wimsey, is this a joke or what? Biggs, you've got a head on your shoulders. Are you going to believe this half-drunk fool and this doddering old idiot who ought to be in his grave?" "That language won't do you any good, Melville," said Sir Impey. "I'm afraid we all saw it clearly enough." "I've been suspecting this some time, you know," said Wimsey. "That's why I asked you two to stay tonight. We don't want to make a public row, but—" "Gentlemen," said Melville more soberly, "I swear to you that I am absolutely innocent of this ghastly thing. Can't you believe me?" "I can believe the evidence of my own eyes, sir," said the Colonel, with some heat. "For the good of the club," said Wimsey, "this couldn't go on, but, also for the good of the club, I think we should all prefer the matter to be quietly arranged. In the face of what Sir Impey and the Colonel can witness, Melville, I'm afraid your protestations are not likely to be credited." Melville looked from the soldier's face to that of the great criminal lawyer. "I don't know what your game is," he said sullenly to Wimsey, "but I can see you've laid a trap and pulled it off all right." "I think, gentlemen," said Wimsey, "that if I might have a word in private with Melville in his own room, I could get the thing settled satisfactorily, without undue fuss." "He'll have to resign his commission," growled the Colonel. I'll put it to him in that light, said Peter. May we go to your room for a minute, Melville? With a lowering brow, the young soldier led the way. Once alone with Wimsey, he turned furiously on him. What do you want? What do you mean by making this monstrous charge? I'll take action for libel. Do, said Wimsey coolly, if you think anybody is likely to believe your story. He lit a cigarette and smiled lazily at the angry young man. Well, what's the meaning of it, anyway? The meaning, said Wimsey, is simply that you, an officer and a member of this club, have been caught red-handed cheating at cards, while playing for money, the witnesses being Sir Impey Biggs, Colonel Marchbanks, and myself. Now I suggest to you, Captain Melville, that your best plan is to let me take charge of Mrs. Roycelander's diamond necklace and portrait, and then just to trickle away quiet-like from these halls of dazzling light, without any questions asked. Melville leapt to his feet. My God, he cried, I can see it now. It's blackmail. You may certainly call it blackmail, and theft, too, said Lord Peter with a shrug. But why these ugly names? I hold 5 aces, you see. Better chuck in your hand. Suppose I say I never heard of the diamonds. It's a bit late now, isn't it? Said Wimsey affably. But in that case, I'm beastly sorry and all that, of course, but we shall have to make tonight's business public. Damn you, muttered Melville. You sneering devil. He showed all his white teeth, half springing with crouched shoulders. Wimsey waited quietly, his hands in his pockets. The rush did not come. With a furious gesture, Melville pulled out his keys and unlocked his dressing case. Take them, he growled, flinging a small parcel on the table. You've got me. Take 'em and go to hell. Eventually. Why not now? Murmured his lordship. Thanks frightfully. Man of peace myself, you know. Hate unpleasantness and all that. He scrutinized his booty carefully, running the stones expertly between his fingers. Over the portrait he pursed up his lips. Yes, he murmured, that would have made a row. He replaced the wrapping and slipped the parcel into his pocket. Well, good night, Melville, and thanks for a pleasant game. I say, Biggs, said Wimsey, when he had returned to the card-room, you've had a lot of experience. What tactics do you think one's justified in using with a blackmailer? Ah, said the K.C., there you've put your fingers on society's sore place, where the law is helpless. Speaking as a man, I'd say nothing could be too bad for the brute. It's a crime crueler and infinitely worse in its results than murder. As a lawyer, I can only say that I have consistently refused to defend a blackmailer or to prosecute any poor devil who does away with his tormentor. Replied Wimsey. What do you say, Colonel? A man like that's a filthy pest, said the little warrior stoutly. Shooting's too good for him. I knew a man, close personal friend, in fact, hounded to death, blew his brains out, one of the best. Don't like to talk about it. I want to show you something, said Wimsey. He picked up the pack which still lay scattered on the table and shuffled it together. Catch hold of these, Colonel, and lay 'em face downwards. That's right. First of all, you cut 'em at the 20th card. You'll see the 7 of diamonds at the bottom, correct? Now I'll call 'em. 10 of hearts, ace of spades, 3 of clubs, 5 of clubs, king of diamonds, 9, jack, 2 of hearts. Right? I could pick 'em all out, you see, except the ace of hearts, and that's here. He leaned forward and produced it dexterously from Sir Impey's breast pocket. I learnt it from a man who shared my dugout near Ypres, he said. You needn't mention tonight's business, you two. There are crimes which the law cannot reach.